listening to him. So, all right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us at 3:20. I know it's getting a little late in the day, and that sunshine outside feels awfully nice. I was just out there myself, but really appreciate you joining us here. I'm MJ Bishop. I'm Vice President for Integrative Learning Design at UMGC. And to my left.
And I'm Sugarman. I'm Vice President for Learning Platforms at AccelerEd. And we chose our title for a reason, because it is a journey that we're on. And the thing that we're not going to do today is give a formula for how to do skills in higher ed, because there's no such thing. We want to share with you the journey, the decisions that we're making, the way that we're approaching things, the thinking of how we're doing what we're doing, and in hopes that it can help you on the journey that many of you will be on in terms of how to bring skills into your curriculum.
So we're going to jump right into it. In March of this year, our CAO, Blakely Palmietto, articulated her vision for post-secondary education that I know many of your academic leaders are voicing as well. And that's that post-secondary education needs to become the equivalent of an interstate highway system that enables learners to pursue multiple educational and career destinations over time without having to follow a linear path. The idea would be that degrees, certificates, credit-bearing courses, badges, micro-credentials, credit for prior learning, all of these things could enable the learner to have a network of paths with on and off ramps that connect these destinations throughout a learner worker's lifetime. And a further vision is that this would enable learners to pursue multiple educational and career destinations over time without having to follow a linear path. So this is an alluring vision, but what's the current reality, Barry?
Oh, there it goes. All right, so we're a higher education institution. Are we talking about degrees? Are we talking about skills? Are we talking about micro-credentials? Is it either or? And the answer is, it isn't an either, right? When we think about where we are in terms of degrees versus micro-credentials, for example, there are over 1 million micro-credentials, unique ones, that are in the market today. SHRM, Society of Human Resource Managers, did a study this past year, and they came up with a couple of interesting findings. First of all, when you think about skills-based hiring, which is looking for the skills rather than just a degree, 90% of executives are interested in skills-based hiring. 15% of companies are actually doing it. So you've got this gap between interest and reality there. And if you dig into the study, it's interesting that executives and hiring managers are the ones who remain most interested in it. HR managers, not so much. Then they did some primary research. And in their primary research, they got a bunch of hiring managers, large number actually, and they put a bunch of resumes in front of them. And each of the resumes had the same work experience, but split evenly between candidates who either A, had a degree, which evidenced the kind of skills that you would need for that job, or B, a set of stacked credentials, micro-credentials, that also evidenced the skills that you would need for that job. In almost all cases, which resume did the hiring manager choose? That's for you, question. Which one do you think? You're exactly right, it's the degree. In something like 19 out of 20 cases. But here's the kicker. When they changed the name of the university, they actually made up the name of the university, so it didn't exist, it didn't change the likelihood. So what does that mean? It means that the hiring manager isn't choosing Harvard, they're not choosing UMGC, they're choosing the idea of a university, which they understand, and in particular, they trust. And that is what really opens up the perspective that MJ and I have on this, which is we are very interested in micro-credentials and in moving ourselves in that direction. But today, we're focused on degree plus skills. It's not an either or for us.
Exactly the case. And of course, you know, most of our institutions, including us, there we go again, it is continuing to advance on its own. Most of our institutions, including us, are really pushing hard towards this scramble to address skills in our curriculum design. And we've encountered several obstacles along the way, and we hope to touch on each of these a little bit in our conversation here and share some of the lessons learned that we've had over this last year or so. First, of course, is that either or thinking about skills. And you know, our argument, as we'll talk about today, is that it really needs to be both and. The other thing that we've seen is that our traditional ways of thinking about design and delivery of curricula is getting in our way a little bit, and we'll speak to that somewhat. That was an aha that I had as an instructional designer myself and leading an instructional design team about the way we're thinking about these problems. Fragmentation in the skills vendor marketplace is another issue that we're seeing, and we've struggled for the last year in trying to figure out who are the right partners, and I'm still not sure we know exactly who are the right partners, but spoiler alert, obviously we're here at the D2L Fusion Conference, so I'll tell you that's one at least that we've identified that we're very happy about. And then lastly, the academic tendencies to overcomplicate, and something that I've said along the way. The minute that we start into a conversation and a faculty member says, hey, which taxonomy are we going to use? Or starts wordsmithing a definition of skills or whatever it may be, I know we're sunk. And that's something else we'll talk about here, that you know we really need to stop allowing ourselves to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. It's time for us to start diving in and figuring out how to make this work. So, as Barry said, you know, I think our journey is unique in some respects. We're hoping that the lessons that we've learned will help to inform your journeys along this path as well.
So that diving in concept, before getting into any of the complexities, we wanted to build a storehouse of lived experience. Like, we know some things, we know that we know some things. We also know that we don't know a lot of things. And before we start making some key decisions, where these first few slides, and again, what we're reading to you is not like a paper that we wrote. We're reading to you the kinds of conversations that we've been having among ourselves at the leadership level to try to figure out what direction that we want to go. And we consciously have decided to say, okay, we know enough to start playing around. We know enough to start piloting. We know enough to start seeing what it's like to live in a skills-forward world. And that's what we're doing.
So Barry and I met a little, oops, there it goes. It's right after I click that it decides to advance. So Barry and I met just a little over a year ago. I was actually making a transition from a system level position in Maryland. I was directing a Center for Academic Innovation and working with all 12 of our public higher ed institutions. So I do have quite a bit of experience working in more traditional kinds of institutions. But I'm now Vice President for Integrative Learning Design at University of Maryland Global Campus, which you may have heard of or seen some of our ads now. We are a standalone, fully accredited institution. We are not a unit of the University of Maryland. We're part of the university system. We serve 90,000 students, mostly adult learners. We are open access. We have a very large military population. We have military contracts in both Asia and Europe. So that's kind of the makeup of our students, and we've been in business for over 75 years, I think, something along those lines. Several years ago, similar to other institutions like us, UMGC made the decision to spin off a 501c3 nonprofit supporting institution called UMGC Ventures, of which Barry and his team are a part. I'll let him describe a little bit more about that working relationship.
Sure. So AccelerEd is a number of things. One of them is that we're essentially the IT organization for UMGC. UMGC does not have its own IT organization. It's actually AccelerEd. And we're also the learning and innovation and sort of tech forward arm of UMGC. And so we have a very, very close partnership, and MJ and I spend lots and lots of hours together. And so we have been working on this. Well, we started talking about it actually even before MJ started working full-time at UMGC. It was like the very first conversation we had about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So one of the very first projects that we started, actually, as Barry said, started before I joined UMGC, was something called Operation Rising Tide. And Barry, I'll let you take this slide, but we felt it was important to back up about 2 steps in our journey. There we go. In our journey, in order for you all to kind of understand some of the groundwork that went into us being at the place that we are now. So go ahead and describe.
So I joined AccelerEd about a year and a half ago. I was a vice provost at Walden University and spent a dozen years at Laureate Education. And I had sort of the outside, the looking glass in view of UMGC, which was as this highly scaled, fully online institution. And having spent some time in the for-profit space, I imagined that culturally it was kind of like that because it's scaled online. And what I learned is that actually UMGC has culturally an awful lot more to do or in relationship to a traditional university than it does what I was accustomed to. And what that traditional university culture has led to is really faculty, not just faculty-driven curriculum as it should be, but faculty-driven design of learner experiences to the point of navigation in the courses, so that you could go through an orientation and learn how to navigate through one course, and that doesn't really help you navigate in other courses because everyone has menus different and buttons in different places and colors are different. And so we decided that we needed to do something about that for a couple of reasons. One, for our students, for our 90,000 students and for our 5,000 instructors, we needed a more consistent learner experience so that you only had to learn it once. Sounds simple, complex to get to, but sounds simple. But even more important for the work that we're talking about in this meeting, it's very difficult, or it was very difficult, for us to think about a differentiated learning experience, about doing interesting things like skillifying the curriculum, being Skillsforward, when every course was a different experience from every other course. So we embarked on this very large project. We started with our undergraduate curriculum, an inventory of about 600 courses, and we, over a period of about 12 months, we created a new learner experience. We adapted each course to that learner experience. We solidified the navigation, colors, look and feel, so that now you only have to learn it once. And the learning process for us, for MJ's team, as we had to go really course by course to get this done, is it really set us up now for being able to think about what does our curriculum need from the skills standpoint. It just would not have been possible until we tamed the tiger of getting at what the differences were from course to course.
So at the same time, I came on board at UMGC. This slide, oops,
Did it again.
this slide is a little washed out, but hopefully you can read enough of the text to make sense of it. But I joined UMGC and had the once-in-a-lifetime career opportunity to build a unit up from scratch. We needed to rebuild the learning design unit. And the vision for this was that rather than to have an army of instructional designers and learning technologists and so forth, that we would try to develop a unit that is a lot more nimble and agile and allowed us to move in and out of projects in ways in which we would partner with external providers to provide the additional expertise that we need. The example our CAO often uses, we, like many others, are starting to dabble in VR. We don't have a lot of expertise on the team. We bring in an external partner to support that work, learn from them, and kind of move in and out a bit more agilely of these kinds of projects. In our environment, we do not have full-time faculty, or we do not have tenured faculty. We do have full-time faculty in the form of program directors and collegiate faculty who support the design and development of programs. And of course now our unit is helping them to realize that vision. So we have 3 schools: cyber and information technology, business, and arts and sciences. And I've got a director of learning solutions assigned to each of those units, actually 2 for arts and sciences, because they're always extra special. So we've got, and I deliberately hired for folks who weren't just instructional designers, but also had disciplinary knowledge in the space, because I wanted them to walk into this conversation, walking the talk and talking the talk and walking the walk, and able to talk to a disciplinary expert about the learning theory in this space. I know what it takes to learn mathematics online and so forth. So we've got a pretty solid team, and then in addition to that, of course, are forming these partnerships, first and foremost with AccelerEd, D2L, and others as we're going along and working through these processes. So important for you to understand sort of that mix of things that allows us to move in and out of this skills conversation in an interesting way, I think.
Yeah, and the decision point that we had, again, going back a bit over a year ago, was if we were going to undertake a project like upskilling the curriculum, skillifying the curriculum, being skills forward, that it's not just that we needed to tame the tiger from a learner experience standpoint, but we needed to have a consistency of approach organizationally too. And particularly because we really did have a very strong faculty-led effort in our program directors, and we still have strong work in our program directors in the directionality of the curriculum from a content standpoint, but making decisions about having a consistent approach to skills meant that we had to have an organization that could help deliver it.
So another thing that's happening for us, and Barry, I'll let you speak to this slide, but I'll watch to see it advance on its own first. And then it won't, of course, because I'm prepared for it this time.
Okay.
But we're also starting to take more of a product management approach in the ways we're thinking about the customers who are coming to us. You want to speak a little to this slide?
So as we started to reflect on what skills meant to us at UMGC, we needed to get back to who our learners are. And the way that we approached that question was thinking about it from the perspective of not just who are they, but why are they coming to us? And our framing for that, if you've read anything from Clayton Christensen, Disruptive Innovation, Marketing, he did some work with his team in a different way of thinking about why people buy products. And the way that they approached it is thinking about why do people hire a product to do a job for them? And if you Google on Clayton Christensen and the job of a product, you'll see there's a consultancy that he and his team did for a major fast food company, you'll probably know who it is, because they had a really thick milkshake whose sales were falling. And they tried all the usual marketing stuff. They did product mix and ingredients and demographics, and they couldn't get the numbers to go up. So they brought in Christensen and his team, and they did an observational study watching people come in and buy milkshakes. And after they did that for a couple of days, they started interviewing the people who would come out with their milkshakes. And the question that they asked them is, what job are you hiring your milkshake to do? People didn't quite get that, so they had to explain it a little bit. And once they understood it, they started talking about what the milkshake did for them. Not that they liked the flavor of it, but what did it do for them? And I'll fast forward, watch the video, go find the video. The job that it did for them was that they had a long commute, they needed something to keep them company. That really thick shake was hard to suck through that straw, and it lasted for the entire commute. They could do it with one hand because the other hand had to drive. It did a better job than bagels, it did a better job than bananas, and it was their companion for their commute. That framing of it, what job are they hiring you to do, is the approach that we're taking with our students in the skills space. What job are our students hiring our degrees to do for them?
And as we look to learner segments and think about this, actually Accenture, there it goes. Accenture did a survey of about 6,500 learners in the fall of 2021. Here's another washed out slide, but the titles on this talk in terms of the junior specialists who are focused on pursuing a credential to secure their first job in a specific field, campus enthusiasts who are more or less our residential students, more traditional learners, the 18-year-olds right out of high school, the wayfinding intellectuals who are curious students seeking to explore a broad array of disciplines to conduct research and so forth. The trajectory transformers who are full-time workers who are skeptical about value and outcomes of credentials but seek short focused programs for building specific skills and being able to change careers. The mid-career climbers who are looking to advance their careers. And then over in the lower left, the evolving professionals, successful early stage workers seeking to expand their industry knowledge. So note that, kind of the below the line, the lower half of this slide, the evolving professionals, the trajectory transformers, the mid-career climbers make up 49% of the learners surveyed. And if you add those junior specialists to the mix, it goes up to 77%. This is a huge portion of our market segment who is not coming to us to get the degree job done. They're coming to us for a variety of different reasons, not a degree. And so as I started to think about this and the ways in which we think about design, it occurred to me that we're kind of locked into our thinking around the degree as being the unit of measure, right? The degree being the thing that is the end-all be-all. And as I started trying to find ways to sort of free ourselves from that perspective, it occurred to me that, you know, our traditional way of thinking, not just about the design of curriculum, but the way in which we deliver it as well, presupposes that presupposes who our students should be as compared to reaching the students we have. That it assumes everyone's coming to us with a blank slate as compared to valuing the experiences and prior knowledge that they bring with them. It defines success only as degree completion instead of helping learners articulate and achieve their goals. It tends to focus on summative assessments instead of more formative ways and scaffolding continuous improvement of continuous learning. It provides little career support instead of helping our learners connect the dots. It assumes learning stops outside the classroom instead of interweaving those didactic and experiential experiences. It communicates what learners are taught instead of communicating what learners know and are able to do, and tends to open doors to potential entry-level careers early in life instead of supporting learning and professional development across a lifetime. So the old, you know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail thing, I think really holds true here. If we continue to think only in terms of the degree as being the end-all be-all, we will continue to, you know, kind of have this less learner-centered approach to the way we're thinking about our design. So as we get, you know, to thinking in terms of moving in these directions, it may actually make it possible for us to achieve that vision of, you know, the post-secondary education as a highway, an interstate highway.
And you focus on teaching the students you have, not the students you thought you had, the students you want, the students who might have. You teach the students you have. And if you add up the numbers in that last slide, 85% of participants in post-secondary learning in the United States are not 18 to 22-year-old kids going to college. It's an oxymoron to call 85% non-traditional. They're not non-traditional. They're the traditional ones now. At least they are for us, right? Because we're 100% in that market. But most of you, depending upon the nature of your institution, more and more, the things you used to call traditional aren't going to be quite so traditional anymore.
So you get the hard one. What's a skill?
What's a skill? So we've used the term. And we, obviously, in your institution, you need to define it for yourself. And there's nothing very surprising about our definition. But we needed to have one, right? And so it's a phrase or a statement that describes an individual's demonstrated, and we highlighted that word for a reason, knowledge, skills, abilities, learned behaviors, right? So what it isn't a word. It isn't, for example, Python programming. That's not a skill.
We thought it was.
No.
We did. We thought
Well,
it
we
might
did,
be.
yeah, we did. We thought it was. And in fact, if you look at some of the taxonomies, you get just a word out of them. We'll talk about that more in a second. But Python programming isn't a skill. The skill is leveling, the skill is demonstration, the skill is a statement, and we'll get to this more in a minute, that would feel at home on a job description. For us, that's what a skill is. It's a lived skill.
So, of course, the next question, and I'm sure the instructional designers in the room are asking this of themselves, so what the heck is the difference then between a skill and a learning objective? Well, and this is a question we've gotten asked a lot by our faculty as we've gone to them and started to think about how we go about this skills mapping. I've been arguing that I think actually, you know, we talk about both and. We need both and. We will continue to need, at the very least for our accreditation, to rely on institutional learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, career, course learning objectives, and so forth. And employers, of course, will also continue to demand that we actually are speaking in skills language that they understand. So what I've been saying is, you know, what we really need is a Rosetta Stone here. What we need on our side is to be able to make this translation between the things that we need and still rely on for instructional design purposes around learning objectives and so forth that help us figure out what's the assessment going to need to look like, exactly what they're supposed to be doing and demonstrating. But that language that we're using then also needs to be translated out of the academies and into something that not only that employers will understand, but that our students have really learned how to articulate themselves. So we have a little bit of an example of this, but before we get to that, I also wanted to, oops, it went too far again. Shoot. We're going to blow all of our punchlines this way. That's what happens when it goes advances. So you know, the other thing that has occurred to me as we've been thinking about this, and this is one example of many that we might offer, that really instructional designers have been thinking in terms of this more modularized approach to design of curriculum forever, right? This is Bob Gagne, Bloom's taxonomy kind of stuff. This happens to be a diagram, and it's another thing you can Google and find, that was created by Iowa State University that I just love. It juxtaposes the cognitive processes dimensions against the knowledge dimensions and provides us with this sort of interesting grid of increasingly higher level, let's call them skills. We could call them competency. We could call them higher order thinking skills. The bottom line is they are modules. They are individual chunks of learning that we as designers think about very cyclically and about building one on top of the other. Stackable, right? We're using all this new terminology, and I would argue that I don't think a lot of this is really new to instructional designers. This is the way we've designed curriculum forever. So consider each of these as a category of skills. We could call them macaroni and widgets for all I care, but they are actually, it's the way in which we've designed our instruction. So Barry, then, when we get to this, how do we translate that? Oops, I'm juggling too many things.
All right. So you think about it like a crosswalk. Think about it like a crosswalk. So in this Iowa State three-dimensional model, if you take a look at the top, I'm not going to read them to you, but if you take a look at the top, those are 2 live learning outcomes from a course in data analytics, right? And they're phrased in appropriate Bloom's language. Who likes Bloom's here? Y'all friends with Bloom's? Yeah, sort of. Yeah. So it's good Bloom's language. Could you imagine those 2 outcomes showing up in the skills section of a job description? I can't. That's not the kind of language that you see in a job description. It's also not specific enough. And it doesn't really get at the nature of the demonstration. So what this crosswalk can do for us, and we're really just starting to play with it, is we looked at those outcomes and we said, okay, well, first of all, they're both applies from a Bloom standpoint, but they're also procedural in terms of doing something. And if you do that where I drew the lines on there, a procedural apply is a carry out something. And in this case, the skill, and I'll actually bend over and read it, carry out leveraging a tool, which in this case is AutoML, which is a tool for machine learning. Leverage AutoML for automating the end-to-end process of applying machine learning to consumer purchase behavior data. You can imagine the project that's behind that. You can imagine the visceral thing that a student graduating can show to a prospective employer, if they had an e-portfolio, if they had a CLR, that they could show to a prospective employer the skill that they've demonstrated. And in the end, it's about a transaction, right? It's the transaction between the student and the employer of saying, I can do what you want me to do. Skills enable that transaction, they enable that conversation. And this crosswalk is important for us because we can't just create a disjointed, disconnected set of skills, recognizing that from a regulatory governance standpoint, we need to live with outcomes, right? They're not going away, as MJ said. So we have to be able to crosswalk them in a meaningful way.
So I'm going to go off script for 1 sec because I want to skip ahead a couple of slides. We'll come back to those. But I want to emphasize here that in addition to what Barry just described, that we're thinking about, when we talk about a skills-forward approach to curriculum design, about a whole series of things. So in addition to this notion of, kind of creating a skills infrastructure, we're also talking about being very intentional in the design of our courses to make sure that we're being explicit about those skills, that our learners aren't coming away with the learning outcome necessarily, but rather that they understand the skills that they have acquired in language that employers understand as well, so that they really can be articulate about that and understand how these things add up to something that makes them employable. In addition, we're looking hard at strengths-based placement and thinking about the ways in which, as we have identified skills, that we can begin looking at self-assessments, diagnostic sorts of exams at the beginning of a course or quizzes that allow them to move through modules more quickly and to advance more quickly through credit for prior learning. Lots of embedded supports, experiential learning, and of course, most importantly, that validation of the skills that they're achieving through some sort of a comprehensive learner record or something that allows them to see their progress through the course. So to Barry's point about, these statements being something that employers understand, we also feel very strongly, given the data we know right now about where the employers are, that the really critical thing is that our students are coming away from these experiences understanding the skills that they've achieved and are ready to be articulate about it in a job interview or wherever it may be. So Barry, I'm going to go back to the kind of the process here.
Okay, so begin at the beginning. I mentioned for the Operation Rising Tide, we have an undergraduate inventory of 600 courses, a graduate inventory of 400 courses. So if we're going to have a skills-forward curriculum, the place where you begin is, so what skills are in there now? Like, what skills are we teaching? How are they being demonstrated? And that's not a small task if you've got an inventory of 1,000 courses. You don't know it just by looking at the syllabus and reading the course learning outcomes, as we were showing in that crosswalk a minute ago. So to give us a leg up on that very large task, we are piloting a couple of AI tools. You might have heard of some of them. So Skilliby is one of them. Who's heard of Skilliby from Lightcast? Yeah? Okay. Skilliby scrapes syllabi for skills terms against the Lightcast taxonomy. And so running through an engine, the syllabi come back with a set of skills terms that are appropriate for those particular courses. It gets us a part of the way there. In the same way, by the way, that we had a very different learning experience before Operation Rising Tide in each of those courses, we've also kind of had a different syllabi experience in many of them too. So some of our syllabi are better than others for being scraped. So we're also piloting another tool by a company called AI, which is scraping the D2L part of the equation for us and saying, so what's actually inside of D2L in terms of what we're teaching and the skills that come out of them? In both cases, it's not about getting the final answer, kind of like playing with ChatGPT. In both cases, it's about seeding the work that a faculty member or subject matter expert will do to actually come up with the skills statements that are appropriate for the courses. But you're starting several steps into it rather than at the very beginning. And so in the pilot work that we're doing, these two tools are being very helpful in getting that process going for us. And once we identify those skills, of course, of what's in there right now, we can have a conversation then about, well, gee, what are the gaps? Like, okay, I get the learning outcomes that were there before, but what are the skills that we should be teaching that we're not teaching now that you see the skills that are there? And so that gives directionality to skills-forward curriculum development going forward.
But I will add to that by saying that we're still getting fairly disembodied lists of words out of these pilots. Business analytics course that has economics, Gantt charts, communication, and it's like, well, how do all these things add up together? And, at least at this point, it's still very much a manual process of figuring out, going back to the taxonomy kinds of approaches, what are the enabling skills leading to the terminal skills? How do these things stack up and add up to something that makes sense at the top? And, I think there's been some very interesting work done at Indiana, at Northeastern. I'm sure some of you all have seen some of the news on these things, but it's still involving quite a bit of manual effort with faculty in order or instructional designers in order to get there.
So it's why we didn't start with the complexity of the taxonomy first. We're not saying that we're never going to play with the taxonomy, but starting with the taxonomy first makes the job more difficult, we think. And two, it really disconnects you from what's really happening inside your curriculum. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to live inside the curriculum that we have, figure out what we think is being taught and demonstrated, make sense of that in the context of some real life pilots, and that will provide the directionality for us going forward when we then want to scale it to all of the other programs.
So we are starting with 6 programs that we're piloting at the moment. We started with the MBA program, which is kind of out ahead at this point on this work. We've got a learning design and technology program. I decided, that program director was going to be very understanding of what we were trying to accomplish, so she's been terrific. And then data analytics, cyber, and undergrad psychology program, which has been interesting to add to the mix, particularly as we're undergoing a general education redesign. And trying to figure out, all right, how do the general education skills fit into this? Are they part of a taxonomy that we would include in a major? How does all of this stuff interact and work together? So it's been interesting so far. We are going to start the redesign of these programs actually as soon as possible with the skills maps that we've developed, and are looking forward to seeing how all of this pans out. But those redesigns will, in fact, as I said before, include not only very deliberate use of the terminology and the skills statements that we've come up with, but we're actually even creating call-out boxes and things so that on particular screens of the course, students are really seeing, okay, this is, at this point, yes, you're analyzing this novel, but at the same time, you're also gaining critical thinking skills, and here's what that means. So really trying to make sure all of that's very carefully spelled out for students as they move through the program. And we're getting close to time here, Barry, so... I want to talk a little bit about D2L.
Yep, it's actually the last slide. And this is really kind of like where we are right now. So we've spent most of the time talking about the curriculum side of it, which is also the change management exercise that you go through in something like this. But of course, there's a technology component to this right now. So where we are in our production instance of D2L, we're not really configured today for modular skills-oriented development. So we're working very closely with D2L to come up with a path that takes us to a structure, organizational structure, roles, responsibilities, configurations that can work with modular skills development, right? And so D2L has been a very strong partner in that. Of course, not surprising, you've probably heard some of the things at the Solutions Showcase and elsewhere, where D2L is moving in the direction from an architectural standpoint of what does it mean for the platform itself to be ready for skills. And we're staying very close to D2L in that directionality too, so that we can do the work that we're doing today and be aligned with the directionality of D2L going forward. And in the end, it's still a bit of an ecosystem, meaning that D2L will, we hope, will do most of the things that we needed to do. Maybe it's not going to do everything. We identify other partners like Skillify, like ENAI, and others that we'll use over time that will help us achieve some of our objectives. And so that's really the place where we find ourselves right now. Is we're way into the piloting of these 5 or 6 programs. We've had some really wonderful, not just conversations, but with the help of D2L, a lot of really good thinking on the structure of how we're approaching our environment today. And we're just kind of on the cusp of reimagining what our structure is going to look like going forward. So it's not the end of our journey. In fact, we're still really at the beginning of our journey, but that's where we are in our journey. So this is really the story that we wanted to tell you, and I think we've left enough time for at least a few questions.
Yeah, just one or two, and hopefully, the journey can help to sort of open up this conversation and a realization that while, we're all reading a lot in the media about how, some institutions are at least claiming they have this all figured out. Barry and I are a little skeptical about that, given our experience so far. I think, you know, we're all in the process of figuring this out, and I'm hopeful that, you know, D2L and others, partners that we have, can help us facilitate a broader conversation around how to accomplish these goals and get to that place where we have that interstate highway.
Good. So questions?
Go ahead.
From conception to where you are today, about how much time did that take for, I think you said the 5 programs you were looking at? And if I'm understanding correctly, I don't think you launched. Do you have an anticipated launch date?
Yeah, so the 5 programs will actually launch next fall. The process of working on the skills for the MBA was a lot longer because that was our first, and that was a fairly major redesign at the same time. So it was not new program development. It was there was a lot of change management in there too, as you can imagine, undoing some thinking and so forth. The subsequent 5 programs went a lot faster. In fact, we started that, I think it was beginning of May, and had a pretty intensive couple of months with the program directors to identify the skills and get everything mapped and laid out. And that will continue to be tweaked, I'm sure, as we get into the did I get cut off? Was it time? Into the full redesigns. You know, we should. I would say probably at this point we're running at about 8 to 10 weeks, but it's an intensive process. Well, thank you all very much for your time.